Oh, can you believe this? Oh, all right. So look, hey, it's me. It's another episode of Film Shriek. We're doing this. Thanks for coming by. Thanks for checking this out. Thanks for listening. All that stuff. Hey, you're cool. You're the best. I appreciate it. I want to get right into this episode. This is something that I'm recording kind of on the spot because I just have a lot of thoughts and a lot of excitement for this documentary I just saw, Becoming Led Zeppelin. Now, I don't think I've ever really talked about it much. I've talked about some documentaries about different bands and artists and musicians and all that kind of stuff in previous episodes. Led Zeppelin for me is the band, right? That's my band. When I was growing up as a teenager, that was the band that kind of opened the doors for me, right? The Doors themselves were another band, but Led Zeppelin was first. I grew up in the like late 80s into the 90s. So there was a lot that was going on in terms of like rock music and pop music and all that stuff. Even hip hop was coming around and that was becoming its own thing at the time. But for me, it was more about going back, looking back and finding this band specifically that spoke to me in a way that a lot of stuff of the time really wasn't doing. And just because of, hey, that was the point in life where I was at, it's like that's the music, that's the sort of the vibe that I carried with me for so long, really for a long time. Musical taste, stylistic taste, or whatever, it just fit for me, it felt like. And yet, I didn't really know much about the members of the group. You know their names, of course, and you know who's who. And everything at the time that I saw or read about the band, because they had already disbanded. 1980 was when they finally kind of called it quits after John Bonham passed away. So they weren't an active thing anymore. And so a lot of what I saw was kind of looking back, like, I think, what was the book? Was it Hammer of the Gods? Right? Was that the book that was around in that time? And it was kind of recounting some of the wild things that they did as a band and some of their tour, what do you want to call it? Adventures on tour, right? And so that was really the only sense I had of who these guys were, like that made this music, because it wasn't like they were the Beatles or the Stones or some of these other bands where the members themselves were such big personalities and did their own thing. Like they became their own presence outside of the band as a whole. Led Zeppelin, I think they stuck to the concept of like, we are one, essentially. We are one entity, and our music is not meant to be shared in a way that is very casual. It's really for deeper listening, right? It's for audiences who really give a shit. And so something about that just really translated to me. Like I connected with that, even on a subconscious level at the time. And so that music of that time for me, it really just signified the best of not only musicianship but songwriting and production and craft, but also this sort of otherworldliness, like a magic to the music. And so that's where that band has lived with me for a long time. I mean, we're talking now probably 40 years. Yeah, I'm old. So what? But, in that time, there's only been one other film, and that was, I guess, their sort of official film, which was The Song Remains the Same, which is a mix of concert footage and some filmed vignettes that kind of revolve around each of the four members of the band, right? And, I think it's more conceptual than anything else. It doesn't really hold together as either a narrative feature film or as a concert film. I can't really say I've ever understood it entirely. I appreciate it for what it is, for being some kind of glimpse into the band and their music. But it's very conceptual, and I just don't really feel like it's never really felt like the film that band deserves. So where this documentary really fits, I think, is that it's a little bit of looking at their music and looking at some of the beginnings, some of the origins of the music, but also trying to understand these members of the band, right? You got Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham. And I think they represent a pretty big, a pretty significant era and movement in British music in the 60s, and how there was this sort of searching, this need to find a sound, to make an impact, to do something with your craft. And it at least weaves the tale of how all four of them, through their own ways and their own adventures and misadventures, ended up finally in the same room with each other and made some magic. It talks about their influences, talks about some of the tries that they had at having bands and playing music and performing, and some of the sort of setbacks they had with family and the people that they were in bands with, and how those things didn't really always work out. And it was Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones that sort of at a very young age, as teenagers, became session musicians and ended up working with really big, really iconic music artists. Some of that I kind of knew. There's another documentary called It Might Get Loud, right? And that's got Jimmy Page, Jack White, and The Edge. And there's a little bit of Jimmy Page talking about his history and his start getting into music, getting into the guitar, getting into production. But this documentary, I think, at least gives us a look at all four of the members of the band, and how, it's just serendipity as they all found themselves at the right place at the right time. One thing I didn't even know, like I guess I sort of understood how it worked, but this documentary really lays out moment by moment how they go from being a sort of a rebuild of the Yardbirds, when all of the members basically leave the band and Jimmy Page is kind of standing there just, with his guitar in his hand. And he finds these three other guys and they all kind of reform the Yardbirds for one performance. And after that performance, they're like, nope, we're something new. And they become Led Zeppelin. And then we go through that whole year of, I think it's like January 1969 to January 1970. It's basically like a year's time span from when they first met, first recorded, and then they did a tour of the US. And then they came back to do the second album, Led Zeppelin 2. And that's when it really popped for them, right? That's when they really blew up. See, if you're not around at the time, if you don't understand sort of the sequence of events and how these things work, it's hard to know this stuff. So this, I thought, I mean, in one sense, I feel like this film, this documentary, it's for the real fans. And I just mean real fans, like people who know the music and understand the music, but maybe didn't all get to see the band perform live. Even if you're around at the time, if you were someone who was around in the 70s or even in the late 60s and would have been able to see this band perform live, they stopped performing in 1980. And they've had a few reunions since then, but it's really kind of this like mythological sort of experience that only some people understand what it's like. And so this film, look, that's the other thing. This film, I saw it on IMAX, the biggest and loudest and really best presentation format that you could have for a film like this. And the film starts with a song. And it's a song, it's an album track. So it's nothing necessarily new, especially if you know the music. But it's one thing to hear it in this format with this sound system that IMAX gives you, that it just blows you away. And I've heard their music so much over the years that I can't really say I heard anything new. I feel like I've really worn the tapes out on these songs. Like I know all the notes, I know all of the textures, I know all of the transition, it's so like ingrained in my mind. And I for a moment I thought, oh, I might actually hear something new in these songs. That didn't really happen. But not only playing the actual like album tracks in the film, This documentary goes on to show us some full live performances. And I don't know if some of these have maybe never been seen, or maybe they haven't been seen in this way at least. But those kind of opened my eyes to a couple different things. The live performances that I have seen of Led Zeppelin, even some of the reunion stuff, right? It's been it's always been a thing in the back of my mind of like, these guys, they're kind of a messy live band. Like, they don't really give us the songs like they are in the album, huh? They sound a little sloppy. They sound a little bit like out of tune, or out of practice or something, you know? And especially here later years, I think the last reunion in like 2010 or 2012, it's been a while. But that concert, which I personally think is just magnificent, even those renditions of the songs, like they're not quite what you hear on the album. And I don't mean like they're just different. I mean like they're a little rough. They feel like they're kind of scratchy, you know? And so watching the live performances in this documentary, I turned a corner on that. And I was just talking to somebody about this, and it was a thing that always kind of bugged me about the thought of seeing the band live. It's never going to be possible, of course, but just the thought of it is like, I'm going to like it, but I'm also going to be bugged by it. But some of the performances that they show, yeah, they are kind of messy and they're a little sloppy and they're kind of all over the place. But something I didn't realize is that the songs, they are reworking the songs, and it's even kind of explained in some of the interviews with Jimmy Page and the guys. It's like there's a little bit of an element of jazz happening here. It's a little bit improvisational. You know the template, you've got the map, but we might take a little detour here and there. And we might kind of just stretch our legs over here and then slow it down over there where it isn't like that on the album. And seeing it like in a full live performance and seeing it in this format, to me, it actually kind of changed my mind. I still think some of the playing feels a little rough and sloppy, but I can see now, or I can understand like, oh, okay, this is what they were doing. They were really opening these songs up. And as much as I've heard the album versions, you're like, well, there is no better version of this song. Maybe not true. Maybe not the case. So this documentary at least gives a little bit of a different perspective on that. I don't know if it's really an appreciation because I still love the albums. I love the album versions of these songs. But it tells me like these weren't just guys who nailed it in the studio and never tried anything outside of that. You know, the last album that they put out, Coda, it's got I Can't Quit You, Babe, right? That's the one where it's on the first album, but then they re-recorded the song and put it out on their last album. And it is the same song, but there are parts of it that are different. I remember at the time, even as a young teenager, buying that last album, Coda, buying it on cassette tape. And I'm like, well, why did they put the same song on two albums? And listening to it, I'm like, well, clearly the original, the one on the first album, that's the better version. And I thought, well, is this like filler? Is this like, well, we just wanted to show we could still play this same song? Because like any other band, over the 10 albums, the music changed, the music evolved and grew. And now I can just see it like, well, no, this is just like an alternate take, you know? So I really think, look, if you're not a fan or if you don't even know the band or know the music, that's fine. But if you do, this documentary is pretty much like handmade for you. It's got so much footage of live performances of them in the moment, you know, in the late 60s. And whether it's the style or the culture of the time or just seeing things, you know, seeing them in an airport, right? waiting for a plane, and them explaining like how things worked, which is, I'm sure, very different than the way either touring works or just the music industry in general works today. I feel like it's an interesting kind of time capsule also. Not just the band, not just the music, but the world of the time. And it's one of those that I think is inseparable from the music. I think you see some of the places that they were at, some of the things they were doing. It's like you can't imagine other songs happening in that moment. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm kind of layering things, conflating things, I guess. But I think this documentary is a valuable kind of a look at this band that for a fan, I mean, I don't really know you could ask for more. It really is about becoming this band. These four guys finding this sort of wavelength and all gelling and starting out. There's really nothing that talks about anything that happens after the second album, which I think, look, if there were another documentary or some other thing that told that story, I would of course be interested in that also. Well, here's the other thing. There is a point in time, I guess specifically in the late 70s and into the 80s, where a lot of either hard rock or heavy metal music or whatever was being labeled and being stigmatized as this, like, satanic kind of evil music, right? More than just like, oh, that's naughty or that's, crude type of entertainment, but it's like, no, these are dangerous people. These are people you got to watch out for. That's that moment where you could feel like there's something there's something dark in this music, in these people that make this music. And look, I'm sure these guys, just like any 20-year-old who's all of a sudden famous and on stage, they probably got into a lot of shit. But I think this documentary shows us that, yeah, they kind of just started out like everybody else. And maybe they had their own weirdness and their own fascinations with things. And maybe they probably did some things that would not fly today, right? But I think to see that, well, they really were about the music, though. They weren't troublemakers. They weren't actually dangerous people. They are craftsmen. They are artists. And so I think it reframes maybe some of the, I don't know, labels or the sort of cloud that hung over this band or bands like this or music like this, because it's certainly nothing I ever felt. I always thought it's interesting people see this music that way, because if you listen to the albums, like their music, it's got harder songs and sounds to it, but it's not all like that, especially with music that came much later. You get into the eras of like thrash metal or death metal. It's like, this music seems really kind of tame in comparison. So if these people were dangerous and something to be worried about, what the hell are these other people? Right? What is Metallica? I think this helps to kind of destigmatize or kind of reveal a little more about the beginnings of these four men and their sometimes kind of childish fascination with music. I just mean they have like a playful amusement and glee there are moments where you see the three surviving band members, they're listening to a previously unheard interview with John Bonham, who, at this point has been gone for 45 years. And you hear them listening to this interview and you see the looks on their faces. It's like they're hearing the voice of an old friend. And part of it is, it's kind of moving too. So, man, I tell you what, I was just blown away by the documentary. I wish it were in some ways longer, maybe, but I kind of respect the idea of, we're not trying to tell a life story here. We're just trying to tell an origin story, maybe. And really, when it comes down to it, that's kind of all that matters, I guess, because the music, put it this way, I think this lets the music still stand on its own. You know, the first album or the first two albums, as they're kind of broken down in the documentary, it's a useful kind of guide to understand like what went into it, like the work or the sort of production, the experimentation that they were doing to make these songs. But I'm almost okay with, yeah, don't worry about the other albums. Don't worry about the other tours or the other things that happened over the next 10 years. Let me have those as a fan, as a listener. Let me have them as they are recorded, and then I'll be good. So I can respect it, you know? I'm cool with it. So anyway, look, that's a quick one I wanted to do. It's just one film this episode, but it's a very anticipated film for this year, starting off the year with this documentary. Just because I'm a fan, and to hear and see some of this music in IMAX in this sort of sound system. I mean, it's the closest thing you would ever get at this point next to going to an actual live show, which wouldn't happen anyway at this point. So take it for what it is. If this is ever something to see on, like, I don't know, Max or some other Netflix or whatever, it'll do, I'm sure. But come on, you need to see it on the big screen. You need to see it in that sound system. So anyway, that's what I got for this week. If you want to hear some other episodes, you go to filmstreak.com. You can sign up to get those by email. You can do the podcast app thing, whatever you want there. I've got the list of all the films. We're over 600 now. I've got a list on IMDb so you can find out where to stream them or buy tickets in case of this one. And just add them to your list, rate them, review them, whatever people do on IMDb. I don't know. Also, don't forget the earliest episodes of Film Streak. They're behind the paywall now. But you know what? Paywalls are kind of not really necessary, right? Here's the deal. I said in the last episode, I'll remind you again, send me a little note. Go to filmstreak.com, send me a little note. I'll slip you a little something, okay? We'll get you hooked up. You don't got to pay nothing. It's not about the money. It's about making sure you really want to hear these things. So, anyway, I'm out of here for now. I got places to go, things to do, and you know what to do. Go watch something new.